English translation. 688th contact. Part 2. Saturday the 20th of August 2017, 21:52 hours.
Then something else. I'm constantly being told that I should take painkillers for my pain, which I refuse to do. Your father Svath taught me very early on that such drugs attack the liver and would overload it over time, and also when a kind of blocker is taken against it, which is supposed to prevent further damage to health as a result of taking painkillers. The liver itself is, among other things, a detoxification organ, and it also plays an important role in the body's metabolism. It absorbs substances from the intestine, which are immediately utilized, stored, converted, or broken down in the liver cells as needed. However, this process is altered by certain substances contained in the painkillers, and thus damages the liver function, as Svath explained to me. So I avoid painkillers whenever possible and just try not to indulge in sniveling, which I do not find very difficult. But if pain becomes too much, then I can get over it with some solid and powerful curses.
I know that about you because I have heard your expletives many times. But what you say regarding painkiller use in relation to the liver, as explained to you by my father, that is correct. The liver plays a very important role in the body's metabolism, and I will explain the following. Substances from the intestine enter the bloodstream through the so-called portal vein, and in this way enter the liver cells. And as you said, they are immediately broken down, stored, converted, or utilized there as required. In the liver, the cells store various substances, if they are not immediately needed, such as protein building blocks or amino acids, fat, vitamins, and sugar. Sugar is stored in the form of glycogen as well as glucose, which is released into the blood when the blood sugar level drops. However, sugar can also be converted into proteins and fat by the liver cells. The liver produces many important proteins from the protein building blocks, and in this way also produces the clotting factors that cause the blood to clot when injured. Furthermore, the C-reactive protein plays an important role, which comes into play especially in the case of inflammations in the body. Proteins for the transport of fats and hormones in the blood are also produced in the liver, as is a large part of the body's own cholesterol, which is used to form bile. Each day, the liver produces about 1 liter of bile, which is used to digest the fats in food. And as you correctly pointed out, the liver is a very important detoxification organ that regularly converts toxic substances produced in metabolism into harmless substances, such as toxic ammonia into non-toxic urea.
Thanks. But if you do not mind, I would like to read you this, which I found on Wikipedia on the internet and copied out, because I wanted to ask you the question about the function of the liver.
Of course, I like to hear what is written.
Good. Then the following explanation.
Alcohol is also rendered harmless by the liver. Per hour, it can break down about 1 gram of alcohol per 10 kilograms of body weight. The enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase first converts the alcohol into a toxic intermediate stage, before a second liver enzyme, aldehyde dehydrogenase, breaks it down into acetic acid. The second step is missing in Asians, for example, so that the toxic intermediate accumulates and leads to nausea and severe headaches. Excessive alcohol consumption therefore increases the fat content of the body beer belly. The liver also filters hormones, old or defective cells and bacteria out of the blood. It releases water-insoluble pollutants directly into the intestine via the bile and excretes water-soluble ones into the blood. They are carried with the bloodstream to the kidneys where they are excreted from the body in the urine. Drugs are also disposed of in this way by the liver when they have fulfilled their task. An important enzyme for the breakdown of toxins and medicines is cytochrome P450. Since this protein occurs in different variants that are differently active, harmful substances are broken down more slowly in some human beings and remain longer in the blood. This is why a certain dose of a medicine can have different effects on different persons.
Now the question of why painkillers are so unhealthy for the liver in relation to earthly medicines. Can you briefly say something about that, please?
Yes, I can do that. As a rule, earthly painkillers as well as cold mixtures and very many other medicines contain the substance paracetamol, an analgesic and fever-reducing drug from the group of non-opioid analgesics or cyclooxygenase inhibitors. This substance is used in various ways. For example, in self-medication in the form of a mono preparation or as a component of various combination preparations for the symptomatic treatment of colds, fever, and pain. Paracetamol is less good for treating pain caused by inflammation, such as rheumatic diseases. Paracetamol inhibits cyclooxygenase COX-2, a substance produced naturally in the body that is activated when cells are damaged and stimulates the production of prostaglandins that promote inflammation and increase pain. The inhibiting effect of paracetamol is actually only weak, which is why other mechanisms are involved in its effectiveness, which, however, earthly medicine has not yet been able to decipher to a large extent, but which I cannot explain in accordance with our directives. However, paracetamol is often extended in combination preparations with caffeine, which enhances the pain-relieving effect of paracetamol in a small way. Paracetamol also produces side effects, even when it is well tolerated in the range of a weak dosage. When painkillers containing paracetamol are used regularly, the liver suffers a great deal, although side effects are usually not necessarily felt immediately, but in some cases only much later and thus with a time lag. However, if disorders occur in human beings who are ill or also stable, then these can be more far-reaching than is known to earthly medical practitioners. I am aware of the following health disorders: loss of appetite, asthma, autism, abdominal pain, paleness, blood count disorders, diarrhea, emotional dullness, vomiting, stomach pain, gastrointestinal complaints, a rise in liver values, allergic reactions, dizziness, drowsiness, nausea, as well as a cramping of the airways with shortness of breath. If an overdose of paracetamol occurs, this can very well result in severe side effects, whereby the liver in particular can be severely damaged. Medicines containing paracetamol sometimes interact with other medicines or with various active substances and foods. Medicines that stimulate certain liver enzymes can increase the undesirable effects of paracetamol on the liver. These include, for example, certain sleeping pills, medicines for epilepsy, and the active substance rifampicin. Human beings suffering from impaired liver or kidney function should not take any medicines containing paracetamol, but should consult their doctor and have him or her assess whether or not it is permissible to take a paracetamol preparation. This also applies as a rule to chronic alcohol abuse, as well as to human beings suffering from a disorder of liver metabolism or Gilbert's syndrome. It is essential for any human being who is allergic to paracetamol to know that under no circumstances should they use a medicine containing this active substance.
Paracetamol during pregnancy feminizes the offspring. Harpraxis.net. Friday, the 23rd of June, 2017, 14:53 Universal Time Coordinated.
How does it affect children if mothers take paracetamol during pregnancy? Taking paracetamol during pregnancy causes behavioral changes in children. The painkiller inhibits male behavioral patterns and causes female mice to produce fewer eggs in their ovaries later in life. Researchers have now found that the use of paracetamol during pregnancy can inhibit the development of male behavioral patterns in mice. The drug can reduce both sex drive and aggressive behavior. In their study, the scientists from the University of Copenhagen found that taking paracetamol during pregnancy can reduce so-called male behavior patterns. The doctors published the results of their study in the scientific journal Reproduction. Paracetamol harms the development of male behavior patterns. The drug paracetamol is particularly valued for its pain-relieving effect. However, pregnant women should think twice before using paracetamol. In an animal model, the drug led to the suppression of the development of male behavior, say the authors of the study. Paracetamol can cause malformations of the testicles. Earlier studies had already shown that paracetamol can inhibit the development of the male sex hormone testosterone in fetuses. This increases the risk of malformation of the testicles in babies. But a reduced testosterone level in the fetal stage is also significant for the behavior of adult males, the scientists explain. Changes could still be detected in adulthood. Reduced testosterone levels cause male characteristics not to develop as they should, the researchers say. When the experimental animals were exposed to paracetamol during the fetal stage, they could not copulate in the same way as the group of control animals. The so-called male programming had not been properly established during fetal development, which could also be observed in the animals even later in adulthood, the authors add in a press release. Similar experiments on human beings would be inappropriate. The dosage given to the mice was approximately the same as the recommended dosage for pregnant women. Because the experiments are limited to mice, the results cannot be directly applied to human beings, the doctors explain. However, given the certainty about the harmful effects of paracetamol in pregnancy, similar experiments on human beings are inappropriate, they say. Which male behaviors were affected? Testosterone is the primary male sex hormone. It helps develop the masculine programming of the brain. The decreased masculine behaviors in mice observed by the researchers were aggressiveness towards other male mice, the ability to copulate, and the tendency to territorial marking. The acetaminophen-affected mice were significantly more passive than normal in all three factors. They did not attack other male mice, they had trouble reproducing, and they behaved like female mice when it came to territorial marking, say the scientists. How does the lack of testosterone affect the brain? After observing the changed behavioral patterns, the researchers examined the specific effects of a lack of testosterone in the brain. The results were also clear here. The area of the brain that controls the sex drive contained half as many neurons in the paracetamol mice, the expert explained. The inhibition of testosterone also led to a halving of activity in an area of the brain that is significant for male characteristics. Effects on female mice. This study focused on the effect of paracetamol on male characteristics. However, the use of paracetamol during pregnancy also affects the later life of female mice, the study authors explain. In 2016, for example, another study found that female mice had fewer eggs in their ovaries if their mothers received paracetamol during pregnancy. This led to these mice becoming infertile more quickly. As source, the.sot.net.
Another worrying side effect. Painkiller paracetamol leads to emotional blunting. Health Center, Wednesday, the 22nd of April, 2015, midnight UTC.
An unusual side effect has been discovered for the well-known pain-relieving drug paracetamol. It dulls emotions. Over-the-counter painkillers have many side effects. Most of them are gastrointestinal complaints. For paracetamol, one of the most commonly used painkillers worldwide, another, previously unknown side effect has now been discovered. Paracetamol makes you lose your good mood. The painkiller dampens positive feelings, but also sad ones. Paracetamol hidden in more than 600 medicines. Headache, toothache, stomachache, pain in the limbs. People are quick to reach for a painkiller. Often it is paracetamol. However, the painkiller paracetamol is not only found in pure painkillers, but also in combination preparations. For example, many so-called cold remedies also contain paracetamol along with other active ingredients. Paracetamol is also available in combination with other painkillers, with caffeine, with vitamin C, with antispasmodics, etc. depending on which symptoms are to be combated. And so there are more than 600 medicines on the market worldwide that contain paracetamol in some form. In the USA, about a quarter of the total population, more than 80 million human beings are currently taking paracetamol. Paracetamol side effects: asthma, autism, and liver damage. Basically, paracetamol is quite well tolerated. Also, it is believed, because the side effects are not necessarily felt immediately, but in some cases only after a considerable time delay, something that especially children suffer from. It is suspected that paracetamol, if taken by a pregnant woman, can promote the development of autism in the child. Also, when children are given medicines containing paracetamol for fever, these are said to be able to noticeably increase not only the risk of autism, but also the risk of asthma. When paracetamol is used regularly, the liver also suffers greatly. In high doses, the painkiller consumes L-glutathione from the mitochondria of the liver cells. L-glutathione is a highly effective antioxidant produced naturally in the body that protects the liver cells from oxidative damage. If L-glutathione is missing as a result of taking paracetamol, liver damage occurs. It is no wonder that paracetamol is the most frequent cause of acute liver failure in several countries, e.g. in the UK and the USA. Now another side effect has emerged in connection with paracetamol. However, this is not a new side effect that had not existed before, but a side effect of which it had not been known that paracetamol was the cause. The online magazine Psychological Science reported on this in April 2015 from a placebo-controlled study that took place at Ohio State University. Paracetamol leads to emotional blunting. Earlier studies had already shown that paracetamol also has an effect on the psyche. It not only relieves physical pain, but also psychological pain. When psychological pain is treated with medication, however, this usually means that the pain is only dulled. The patient no longer feels so desperate. But he is not exactly cheerful either. So the drug rather leads to a kind of emotionlessness. The Ohio State University study in question involved 82 test persons. After taking paracetamol, or the placebo tablet, they waited 1 hour for the drug to take effect.
Then the participants looked at 40 photographs that had been specially selected by researchers from all over the world to trigger emotional reactions. There were extremely sad motifs, crying malnourished children, or very happy scenes, children playing. There were also neutral photos, a grazing cow. Now the participants were asked to judge the picture itself on the one hand, and on the other hand their feelings when looking at the picture. The results showed that the paracetamol group rated all photographs less emotionally than the placebo group did. Consequently, happy pictures were not perceived as overly happy, and sad pictures did not evoke nearly as sad feelings in the acetaminophen-influenced subjects, as did the placebo group. People taking paracetamol no longer experienced the same emotional highs and lows as other human beings, the scientists explained. And study author Jeffrey Durso added, taking paracetamol seems to have more far-reaching consequences than previously thought. This is because the drug is apparently not only a painkiller, but also an emotional muffler. What was also interesting and frightening was that the test persons did not seem to notice how the drug affected their emotions. Alternatives to painkillers. But you do not have to resort to chemical painkillers for every pain. There are also many remedies in the medicine cabinet that can relieve pain. Even better, of course, would be to prevent many of those diseases associated with pain, such as osteoarthritis, gout and arthritis, with an overall healthy lifestyle. Sources: Durso Gro et al. Over-the-counter relief from pains and pleasures alike. Acetaminophen blunts evaluation sensitivity to both negative and positive stimuli. Psychological Science, 2015. Over-the-counter relief from pain and also pleasure. Acetaminophen blunt sensitivity to negative, as well as positive stimuli. Study as PDF. Ohio State University. Your pain reliever may also be diminishing your joy. Science Daily. Science Daily, the 13th of April, 2015. Your pain reliever may also be diminishing your joy. Study as PDF. Grobere Kistas. Arzneimittel als Mikronahrstoffräuber. First edition 2015. Wissenschaftliche Verlagsgesellschaft Stuttgart Source. The.net.
Death on prescription and no drug without side effects, but do not tell. René Graeber. Thursday, the 13th of July, 2017, 1442 Universal Time Coordinated.
We know the prayer mill-like claim of orthodox medicine and the pharmaceutical industry associated with it that only properly approved medicines are able to heal. According to this, natural remedies do not exist, or cannot exist, since they have no approval and are therefore supposed to be ineffective, contrary to all studies and empirical values. The ridiculousness of the claim to a monopoly on healing is already crystallized here. For the criticism that orthodox medicine does not heal, but rather treats symptoms, is confirmed with such formalized arguments. If one has appropriated this crude logic for oneself, then one also has the ideal blinkers on that block out the view of the negative consequences of numerous medical prescriptions. And with that, the rosy picture of classical medicine would have become reality. And before I am accused of something again, this is not about the fact that I would like a good surgeon to operate on me when my leg is no longer where it should be. This is about the millions of chronically ill people and also acutely ill people who are supposed to take pills, drugs, and medicines every day. No medicine without side effects. An old pharmacological maxim says that pharmacological substances without side effects also have no effects. Or in other words, the better a substance works, the higher the probability of unwanted other effects, called side effects for short. And one of these side effects is death. The extent to which orthodox medicine represses or suppresses this truth is documented by its anti-scientific approach to these facts. This ideology has consequences for the way medicines are newly approved. For the pharmaceutical industry is allowed to build its own studies and thus be its own judge. And this practice has consequences for patients, which I have already described in a plethora of posts. Vaccination against cervical cancer more than controversial, antacids, questionable remedies for heartburn, severe side effects of ADHD drug Strattera, Xarelto, drug of choice or drug of torment. Rotavirus vaccination, recommendation for costly side effects, suffering with cortisone injections, or killing me softly. Fat blockers, the underestimated danger of side effects, the best drugs for getting sick. Cortisone therapy, undesirable side effects, medication side effects, diabetes. Medication side effects, understanding and preventing them, acetylsalicylic acid. Effects, side effects, dosage, studies and interactions, biologics in rheumatism therapy, good effect, good side effect, blood pressure medication, side effect, stroke. Well-known cancer drug, more harm than good? Death on prescription that do not tell. Death on Prescription, that was the title of a program on ARD in 2000, in which a renowned pharmacologist from Bremen, Professor Schonhofer, whose specialty is research into the side effects of medicines, has his say. He assesses the approach of the pharmaceutical industry as follows. Profit is often more important than the patient. Drugs are often rushed onto the market. Using the example of a now practically unknown drug, the antibiotic Trovim, the principle behind this desolate practice is explained. The antibiotic from the Pfizer company was only on the market for 1 year. Due to severe side effects plus deaths, it was taken off the market again. At least, one might almost think. But actually such a substance should never have been approved. The studies before approval showed elevated liver values in the test persons, but the manufacturer swept this under the carpet. Pfizer even officially claimed that Trovim was the best studied drug ever and even better documented than penicillin. After 1 year, the best studied drug of all time was off the market. For Professor Schonhofer, it was clear that the approval of this substance could not be based on scientific principles, but solely on profit motives, as he put it. This is only one example of many, and thus not an exception that confirms any rule. Rather, it seems to be the rule where one has to look for an exception. While we are on the subject of antibiotics, there is also the unpalatable group of fluoroquinolones. A great thing. According to Professor Schonhofer's calculations, at that time there were 16,000 deaths a year due to side effects of the drugs, half of which could have been avoided. And at that time, according to his statements, there were still more than 20,000 drugs on the market for which there had been no approval at all. But that was in the year 2000. Here the hypocrisy of orthodox medicine and the pharmaceutical industry becomes particularly clear, who demand approval, reevaluation, reapproval, etc. for natural remedies that have been tried and tested for decades, but are themselves not in the least prepared to have their own chemical filth subjected to scientific testing. And since little seems to have changed in this practice, the 16,000 deaths from 2000 in 2013 has increased evidence-based and significantly to 58,000 deaths from drug side effects. The carnival of orthodox medicine. The definition of intelligence is very simple. It is the ability to learn. This raises the suspicion that a discipline that produced 16,000 deaths 17 years ago, and then almost 4 times that number 13 years later, has a limited to non-existent capacity to learn. The lack of scientificity would be another indication of this. But I think it is much worse. As Professor Schonhofer had already stated, it is not so much the lack of intelligence, but the interest behind this practice, increasing turnover and profit. This has the highest priority. And the existing intelligence is used to deceive idealistic doctors and patients in the long term. This department is called marketing, which is able to carve the safest thing ever out of a killer drug. This is why it is not uncommon to get the impression that with all this evidence-basedness, science in white coats, the gravitas of medical professors, and other effective advertising methods, medicines can be thrown among the people in a similar way to the carnival figurines in Cologne. After all, the medical figurines are totally safe and also heal. And if there is even an approval, then nothing can go wrong. We have known at the latest since the thalidomide in the early 60s and Avandia, Lipibay and Vioxx after 2000 that something must have changed, something that was able to replace the 16 with a 58 times 1000. RP Online ran this very credible article in 2013 from which these figures emerge. The focus of this article is Professor Sonnachsen from the Institute for General Medicine at the University of Witten/Herdecke. He criticizes that almost 1/3 of all medicines are prescribed without an evidence base. I find this a startling finding for a discipline that claims evidence-basedness and labels naturopathic treatments as not evidence-based. The article cites a study that showed that 90% of patients are prescribed at least one medicine without a corresponding indication equals unfounded. In the case of the elderly equals over 65 years old, in 63% of the cases medicines are given that are as good as contraindicated or ineffective for this age group. I only know a similar procedure from the Cologne Carnival. 10% of emergency admissions due to drug interactions. A study by the Salzburg Hospital in 2008 showed that 10% of emergency admissions were closely related to drug interactions. Professor Sonnachsen knows of other studies that have come to similar conclusions. So this means that in the carnival of orthodox medicine, not only blue or yellow or red figurines are given gladly and abundantly, but all colors mixed up colorfully according to the motto, the more the better. Professor Haefele from Heidelberg University Hospital describes how much these jesters in their white coats appreciate the colorful fancy dress. The average patient leaves our clinic today with 5 medicines. This already results in 26 different combinations that can influence each other. And average does not mean maximum here. There are known cases where patients have had to swallow 20 or more different medicines every day. Aloft and hello. But interactions are not side effects, or are they? Medicines and interactions, a case for evidence-based ignorance, interactions, new medication plans for multiple drug swallowers once again. The cholesterol-lowering drugs Professor Sonnachsen illustrates how questionable this system is with the example of lipid-lowering drugs. This is because they are often prescribed to reduce the risk of heart attacks. Because there are studies carried out by the pharmaceutical industry that claim to have shown this. And they must know, right? For Professor Sonnachsen, however, the situation is completely different. In 100 patients, this prevents 5 heart attacks within 10 years. Statistically evaluated, 75 of them would not have had one anyway, and 20 of them will have one despite treatment with the drug. The risk of side effects and the nature of side effects are rarely mentioned here. For if the priority were the safety of the medication, then Ash Wednesday would have been long ago in orthodox medicine. And I have also written a booklet on this stuff. Prognosis inhibition and the watering can principle. The article gives an interesting explanation for this phenomenon in Germany. He sees the cause in the fact that in Germany, prescribing is inhibited by prognosis. This means that it is a watering can principle that includes everyone who has a certain risk, which in turn can be derived from threshold values for certain laboratory values. So anyone who has a cholesterol value of more than 200 is a risk patient from the point of view of orthodox medicine, if only statistically. But that is enough to expose this patient to a bag full of risk for side effects. After all, the statistics have proven it. Well, and if the patient, for example, also exceeds, as is not uncommon, sustainably lowered threshold values for prediabetes and hypertension, then the doctor reflexively reaches for the prescription pad to add a few more colorful tidbits. We all know how differently patients' organisms function, which is also due to differentiated genetics. But orthodox medicine might make all patients the same with its carnival-like events of handing out fancy dress. So it is not surprising that from this point of view side effects must also occur, even if it is only a single drug. An article from T-Online pharmacologist warns against painkillers, describes the risks of medicines that are now considered normal, safe, well-tolerated, etc. Here, a professor of pharmacology at the University of Erlangen, Professor Brun, has his say. He illustrates to the reader how much chemistry Germans swallow or have to swallow in the course of their lives. On average, every German takes painkillers for 2 months a year from birth to death. 10% of Germans even swallow them every day. Paracetamol and acetylsalicylic acid can lead to death in case of an overdose. Other comparable but more modern active substances such as ibuprofen, diclofenac, and naproxen do not have this side effect. On the other hand, these, for example ibuprofen and diclofenac, are characterized by a kidney-damaging effect, which in the final analysis can also lead to death. But it is not only the kidneys that are at risk. The gastrointestinal tract and lungs can also be affected. Paracetamol has a damaging effect on the liver, which is also present when high doses are not taken. According to Professor Brune, paracetamol would no longer be approved today because the substance is also responsible for heart attacks, hypertension, and brain damage. Acetylsalicylic acid is a popular substance used as a prophylactic against strokes because it has a blood-thinning effect. By the way, blood thinning? Whoever came up with this term deserves the Nobel Prize for medical marketing. I can thin the blood by adding liquid. What really happens, however, is at most an inhibition of coagulation. But here we see again the camel-like watering can principle of orthodox medicine, to put almost every patient who seems to have a statistical risk of stroke on the substance. Here, too, the treating physicians abstract from the risks of uncontrollable bleeding, intestinal ulcers, asthma attacks, etc., because the manufacturers make them believe that the benefits outweigh the risks of side effects. Focus quotes a Swedish study from the University of Linköping, according to which by far the most frequent fatal side effects were hemorrhages that occurred after taking blood-thinning drugs. Since we are also talking about painkillers, which are taken extensively and with pleasure, another critical point is added. And that is the elimination of pain as a warning signal by a chemical cudgel. This ignoring of the body language of the organism alone can lead to lasting complications if the cause of the pain is not recognized and eliminated. But treating the cause has hardly any priority in orthodox medicine. This is nothing new. No wonder, then, if these substances are prescribed or recommended by the medical profession. A Danish poltergeist, and there is another professorial poltergeist in classical medicine, Professor Gotsch. Professor Gotsch is an internist and has conducted clinical trials for pharmaceutical companies for many years. He is co-founder of the Cochrane Collaboration, as well as director of the Nordic Cochrane Center at Rigshospitalet in Copenhagen. The Cochrane Collaboration is known for conducting a number of meta-analyses on various issues. My reservations about meta-analyses lie in the possibility of including only selected studies in the data material, which then bring about the desired result. It seems that Professor Gotsch shares this view. Data extraction errors in meta-analyses that use standardized mean differences. This is obviously another form of deliberate information laundering, as he calls it. He goes on to claim that pharmaceutical companies are not selling drugs, but lies about drugs. And the journals are nothing but information laundries for the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry is organized crime in a Swiss radio program, Deadly Medicine? He is quoted as calling the pharmaceutical industry an organized crime. One reason for these allegations is the fact that pharmaceutical companies themselves are allowed to decide how their new product is tested. They themselves decide how they evaluate the data and are also allowed to decide which of the data are passed on to the regulatory authorities. No wonder, then, that data is doctored in such a way that rosy clouds float in the pharmaceutical sky, sold to us by pharmaceutical marketing as new breakthroughs. When the evidence-based reality comes crashing down on patients, The pharmaceutical companies are only concerned that before the new substance is withdrawn from the market, at least the development costs can be recouped, even if it costs a few lives. How can one reproach the good professor for calling these machinations criminal? Doctors, enforcers and stooges of the pharmaceutical industry, for Professor Gotsch. Doctors themselves are nothing more than executors and stooges of the pharmaceutical industry, who allow themselves to be corrupted by it with gifts of money, expensive meals, expensive trips disguised as further training and so on. Those who prescribe questionable medicines to their patients on the basis of these stimuli, and not on the basis of medical necessity, will sooner or later cause a pharmacological disaster for some of their patients. The patients who will then be affected are those who are the worst off and who depend on good medical care. The healthier ones withstand the pharmacological stress more or less well, indicating that they would also have coped well without seeing a doctor. The fragile patients, on the other hand, collapse under the pharmacological load and become part of a disastrous statistic for side effects and perhaps fatal consequences. The U.S. took 500 cold and allergy drugs off the market in 2016 alone. The number of drugs that were supposedly approved on the basis of evidence, but then removed from the market after a few years is now virtually unmanageable. In 2016 alone, the American FDA took 500 medicines for colds and allergies off the market. Reason: health concerns. This situation seems to confirm the assumption that approvals are nothing but an elaborate form of government marketing for the healthcare system. With a marketing authorization, one can always argue that one has the state's blessing for the substance one is bringing to the people. Approval and drug safety are seen as synonymous, but this quickly goes up in smoke when one looks at the reality. If approved drugs were safe, why are so many withdrawn from the market? Why are there the scandals about Avandia, Vioxx, Lipabay, etc.? Answer: they exist because persons like Professor Gotsch and others know the difference between drug safety and government approval. And this state approval is usually the result of lobbying by the pharmaceutical industry, which forces the responsible politicians with profitable consultancy contracts to decide in their favor. Conclusion: the business with the health or illness of millions of patients is so lucrative that the drug manufacturers do everything they can to maintain and expand this market. And part of this marketing strategy is simply the production of substances that do not work, harm patients, but sell well. Conversely, substances that work well and help patients, but sell poorly or cover too small a market, are not even targeted by the pharmaceutical industry. The vast numbers of substances that have been withdrawn from the market are proof that the evidence-based clinical trial phase is only carried out after official approval. The guinea pigs are then human beings who do not want to be part of a large-scale trial, certainly not without their knowledge, but who are dependent on serious help because of their ailing health. Instead, doctors and pharmaceutical companies enrich themselves from their misery and pretend responsibility and care in the hope of retaining the patients and thus keeping the paying customer for themselves. The bottom line: as long as the health of human beings is nothing but a commodity and not an object for sentimentalism, nothing will change in the whole situation, and if it does, then only for the worse. The increase in deaths from 16,000 to 58,000 in 13 years indicates where this path is leading. Why another approval? Elsewhere, the fig leaves are also being removed. Source: d.sot.net.
Paracetamol. Why the painkiller dampens our compassion. Epoch Times, the 18th of May, 2016.
Paracetamol might make us more indifferent to fellow human beings. That's what a new study on the most commonly bought painkiller shows. A new study by researchers at Ohio State University shows that taking the popular painkiller paracetamol not only reduces pain, but also decreases empathy for physical and social pain experienced by other human beings. Participants in the study who had taken paracetamol rated the unhappiness of others as lower compared to participants who did not take painkillers. The results suggest that other human beings' pain seems like a not-so-big deal to them if they took acetaminophen, said Dominik Mieszkowski, co-author of the study and a member of the National Institute of Health. Acetaminophen paracetamol can reduce empathy and also act as a painkiller. Mieszkowski led the study with Baldwin Way, an assistant professor of psychology, and Jennifer Crocker, a professor of psychology at Ohio State University. Their findings were published online in the journal Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience. Paracetamol is the most common ingredient in medicines. Acetaminophen, the main ingredient in the painkiller Tylenol, is the most common ingredient in medications in the United States, found in more than 600 drugs, according to the trade group the Consumer Healthcare Products Association (CHPA). Each week, more than 23% of American adults, about 52 million human beings, take a drug that contains acetaminophen, CHPA reports. In an earlier study, Baldwin Way and colleagues found that acetaminophen also blunts positive emotions such as joy. Taken together, the two studies suggest there is still a lot to learn about one of the most popular over-the-counter and without a prescription medications in the United States. We do not know why acetaminophen has these effects, but it is concerning, said Way, the study's lead author. Empathy is important. If you are having an argument with your spouse and you've just taken paracetamol, this research suggests you might be less able to understand what you did that hurt your spouse's feelings. Paracetamol deprives human beings of ability to empathize with others. The study procedure is reported by Die Welt as follows. For their study, the researchers recruited 80 college students. 40 of them were given a drink containing 1,000 milligrams of paracetamol, a dose that is also available in Germany without a prescription. The other 40 students were given a drink that did not contain any active ingredient. None of the test subjects knew which group they belonged to. After an hour, the researchers asked the students to read 8 short stories in which someone had a painful experience, a cut, for example, or the loss of a loved human being. The students were asked to indicate on a scale how much pain they thought the person in each story felt. Just as the researchers had suspected, those who had taken paracetamol rated the pain as less bad than those who had been given the drug-free drink. Next, they checked the result in a second experiment. They divided 115 more students into 2 groups, one of which was given paracetamol again and the other a placebo. All the subjects heard a very loud noise. They were asked to state how unpleasant they found it and then imagine how unpleasant others would find it. This also showed, under the influence of the painkiller, the noise seemed less bad to the students. And they also believed that others would feel the same way. Finally, the researchers had the test persons watch a video game sequence in which a person was excluded from a team. In this way, they checked whether someone else's perception of a socially painful experience also suffered when the test persons had taken the painkiller. And the scientists were also correct in this assumption. Paracetamol, the researchers summed up, has psychological side effects that have received little attention so far. It deprives human beings of the ability to empathize with others. MH, source, www.epochtimes.de.
Thanks. Your comments are certainly important for many, because as I know, nearly 600 human beings die every year in the USA alone from liver damage caused by painkillers containing paracetamol. But human beings can also die if they drink too much, which we have already talked about. But I have a little note on this from a magazine. Drinking too much. No, we are not talking about alcohol or soda pop. We are talking about normal water. And yes, you should drink about 3 liters of water a day to avoid dehydration. But if you overdo it, you risk dying unnecessarily. If you drink too much in a short time, you can get water intoxication. The kidneys cannot process this flood, and the water accumulates in the brain and lungs. Even if you do not die from it, water intoxication leads to nausea, headaches, and disorientation.
We have already talked about this several times, and what this little note says is correct as far as it goes, except for the fact that human beings have to drink 3 liters of water a day. This is not true, because the whole of the daily liquid requirement of human beings is completely different from person to person, as you yourself know. On the one hand, the physical daily requirement is dependent on the body's constitution, but on the other hand, it is also dependent on health and the activity that is being carried out. Furthermore, the respective daily and national climate is also important, as well as physical control, which includes the need for fluids. So the daily fluid requirement for the organism can be very small or even larger than 3 liters per day. Consequently, a statement of 3 liters as a daily requirement is extremely misleading.
I know, because I myself often drink no more than 1 or 2 deciliters of water, if that, and also only to take my medication. Maybe once in a while I'll add 1 or 2 coffees to that, but that's not a habit, and one of those is about 1.5 deciliters. If the whole 3 liters a day thing were true, I should have dried up and died long ago. Even when I was in very dry and hot areas and also in deserts during my globetrotting. I never drank much, and therefore did not sweat, for I never drank more than at the very most 1 to 2 liters of bitter tea without sugar per day.
I am aware of that.
Good. Then now a question, because I am asked again and again from all over the world in relation to the events of 2001, when the double attack on the World Trade Center in New York took place on 11/9. 2001 and the crazy conspiracy theory arose from this that the US government and the CIA themselves had planned and carried out this catastrophe. At the time, however, you expressly stated that this was absolute nonsense, because the conspiracy theory had come about and been circulated particularly because many people had heard several explosions that had allegedly been caused by explosives, and for which the blame was conspiratorially placed on the US government and the CIA. But you have explained that these explosions did take place, not because of explosives, but because the many tons of aluminium from the destroyed aircraft melted as thinly as water, and developed tremendous heat, and exploded when they came into contact with the water from the sprinkler systems. Because such thinly liquid aluminium is highly explosive when it comes into contact with water, as you have explained. And the immense heat of the aluminium, which is as thin as water, also melted the steel girders, whose protective concrete shells were torn open by the impact of the planes and exposed the steel, which could not withstand the great heat. According to your explanation, this made it possible for the steel girders to melt, and for them to collapse, and also for the towers to collapse. But you said, I do not know why, because I never ask for such explanations, that I should keep silent for at least 15 years and not say anything, just as I should not write anything down about it. But now this time is over, and moreover I am asked again and again why the World Trade Center event is supposed to be a conspiracy theory. Hence the question whether I am now allowed to speak openly about it and give a correct answer to the questioners.
Today there is nothing to prevent you from answering questions. But the reason why I had to impose silence on you is based on our directives, which did not allow us to reveal facts that first have to be investigated.
You mean in terms of scientific investigations that need to be conducted by Earthlings?
Exactly. And such investigations have been going on for some time in the correct manner. Consequently, the experts are on their way to the correct findings.
Interesting, though, what took them more than 15 years. But that is understandable, because the cogs of science to their findings and progress turn slowly on Earth.
That will change in the more distant future.
I suppose that will be possible, so tell me, are you familiar with Psalm 1-01, the Alien Manual UFO, or whatever it is called?
Yes, why?
I got the following about it from Wikipedia on the internet, about which an Andreas Kramer wrote the following on the 5th of July 2016.
Mystery News. In March 1994, UFO expert Don Berliner received an envelope after an air show, which he immediately opened. He had the film roll inside developed and was astonished when he saw the finished pictures. The pictures were the photograph pages of a manual entitled SOM-1-01 from April 1954, which contained protocols for the recovery and removal of extraterrestrial objects. The independent organization Newfound Neutral UFO Network deals with the analysis of UFO cases, including the explosive secret document SOM-1-01. The document is now referred to as the Alien Handbook and is supposed to prove that the U.S. government is working on extraterrestrial technologies. Intensive analysis of the Alien Manual SOM-1-01, a team of experts from Newfound examined the Alien Manual SOM-1-01 with the assistance of ufologist Stanton Friedman. Photographic prints were made from the negatives. Then the book was comprehensively analyzed. The result was a complete copy of the manual. Stanton Friedman reviewed the pages of SOM-1-01 for references regarding U.S. government bases and facilities that actually existed in 1954. The terms and phrases in the manual were also part of the investigation to determine whether or not these words were in use at the time. The term SOM means Special Operations Manual and apparently comes from the Majestic 12 MJ-12, a secret committee said to have been formed in 1947 by an executive order from U.S. President Harry S. Truman after the Roswell incident. The Alien Manual contains precisely described instructions for the recovery of crashed extraterrestrial flying objects and their removal. According to Newfound, SOM-1-01 was most likely made on behalf of the U.S. government. The instructions in the manual are the result of collected information on UFO events in which the U.S. military has been involved. Instructions for UFO crashes. One of these UFO crashes is said to have occurred in Kingman, Arizona, in May 1953, a year before the SOM-1-01 manual was published. In the incident, the radar station of a military base registered an object on the radar screen, which lost altitude and eventually disappeared, and the colleagues of the radar officer in charge also observed the crash on their radar screens. They immediately drove a jeep to the suspected crash site where, after a brief search, they actually discovered something, namely a metallic flying disc that had no visible damage. Afterwards, the men informed their superiors about the incident. A cordon was set up around the crash site and recovery of the UFO began. The military interviewed eyewitnesses and asked them to maintain absolute silence about this event. As described in SOM-1 to the 01, cordoning off the crash site was the top priority, and the recovery team itself came from the ranks of the U.S. Air Force. According to the alien manual, the entire area was subsequently cleared and unauthorized personnel were ordered to leave the site immediately. All eyewitnesses interviewed were also ordered to leave the area and were not allowed to speak a word about their observations. In April 1954, SOM-1 to the 01 was issued, which meant that the military must have already had experience with the recovery of extraterrestrial flying objects. Incidentally, at the heart of all the provisions of SOM-1 to the 01 is absolute secrecy. The authenticity of the secret document is considered controversial even among experienced ufologists, but events involving UFOs in which the U.S. military was involved may have influenced the alien manual. In the Roswell incident in July 1947, when a crashed UFO was recovered by the U.S. Air Force, the military worked with obscuration strategies, according to Muffin. At the time, the military had not yet recovered a UFO, so no rules existed at the time for dealing with the press. The U.S. Air Force covered up the truth about the Roswell incident with the story of a crashed weather balloon. According to Muffin, the obfuscation strategies described in SOM-1 to the 01 are 100% based on the military's experience of Roswell, where the UFO was recovered and the public deceived. The obfuscation strategies prescribe publishing a denial and silencing the press and eyewitnesses by exposing them to ridicule. Based on MUFON's analysis, the alien manual SOM-1 to the 01 has a high degree of authenticity, but we will never know if the secret document is genuine.
To that now, what is the story behind this, if I may ask you about it?
I am aware of all this and more, but I am bound by our directives, which do not allow me to state the effective facts. However, should you still be interested, I can give you information in secrecy.
I would be interested, but then we can talk privately, and I can also remain silent, as you know. Then something else. In the U.S., the accusations against Russia that it interfered in and manipulated the U.S. presidential election continue unabated, to which you explicitly said that this was not the case. Under this statement of yours, I understood, which we also talked about, that neither Putin nor the government led by him had interfered in any way, which you have clearly clarified. On the other hand, you then privately said that outside of this Putin government framework, you did not carry out any other form of monitoring with regard to electronic and other interference, such as with regard to hackers, etc., who were neither connected with Putin nor with his government. Can you say something about that?
What happened outside the Putin government framework, as you call it, in terms of Russian hacking, etc., we have no knowledge about that because we were limited exclusively to the Putin governmental possibilities, and we were only focused on that. If Russian hackers interfered in the presidential election in a purely private manner, then that falls outside our findings.
So that possibility could exist in some circumstances?
Maybe. But we do not know that. And on the other hand, it is also not of importance for us. Which is why we did not try to clarify this and will not do so, because the whole thing is trivial all around, and would also have had no influence on the American presidential election.
Thanks. Your answer is good enough for me. Another question. Are you aware of anything concerning a secret space shuttle X-37B of the U.S. military? about which it is written that the name alone of this spaceship sounds mysterious, and that this shuttle has already flown 4 times on behalf of the U.S. Air Force into near-Earth space. However, those responsible would not say a word about its concrete mission and the results. These flights must have collected a lot of data, because this 8.8-meter object, which flies like a drone without a crew, has spent almost 6 years in Earth orbit since 2010, with the last flight, which lasted 718 days, ending on the 7th of May 2017. Officials claim that this is just testing a future spacecraft technology.
Which, of course, is not true, as I think you also assume. In fact, we are aware of the whole thing, but our directives
forbid you to talk about it.
Correct, because these are secret matters that we are not allowed to interfere in or disclose information that we know.
You keep saying that, as you also recently stated in response to my private question regarding the so-called Black Knight satellite or Black Knight, that you are not allowed to say anything officially, but to me under secrecy, you are.
Which you also abide by. It may seem strange to you at times because our directives contain information and declarations of secrecy which seem a little strange to you, but which are perfectly justified, whatever you understand, when I explain the whole thing to you.
After all, it was only an observation and not an attack or a rebuke, dear friend.
I did not take it that way either.
Then it is good, but now I have something else that interests me, and which I am sure you can speak openly about. And that is in regard to the weather conditions that are coming further on, after the hurricanes in the USA and further down, if you know anything future about that. I told you some time ago that I do not always want to be informed about future events, because such predictions always bother me. But I am always being harassed about what the future will bring, and that it would be fair if some predictive knowledge were released for those human beings who are really interested in it, and who also heed warnings and behave accordingly. But on the other hand, you also said that you would no longer have to make predictions yourselves via your new foresight technology, but that the new apparatuses would do this independently for over 40 days at a time.
That is correct. And if you really want to be informed about these previews, at least with regard to important events, then I can, of course, give you the necessary information, which you can then also openly mention, while others, which are covered by secrecy, well, as far as your question is concerned, during and also after the passage of the hurricanes, which will cause very serious damage and destruction in the southeast of the USA as well as on the islands to the south, such as Cuba, such severe storms will also break over Europe. Elemental storms up to hurricanes and tornadoes with speeds of up to 150 kilometers per hour, possibly more, will rage equally in northern and southern Europe. In other words, violent storms will occur from the North Sea to the Mediterranean and from the Atlantic to the Far East, and thus as far as the Pacific. Africa will also be affected in some places, as will the Near East, Southeast Asia, and Asia proper, with China, Japan, and other areas there being particularly affected in the near future, as well as the vast expanses of the Pacific and the verses of the islands as far down as New Zealand. Everywhere there will be great damage and destruction, and human lives will be lost, from which also Europe from north to south and from west to east will not be spared. Also everywhere in those countries where the monsoon season has begun, there will be heavy damage and destruction of human beings' achievements, and many human beings will lose their lives through the violent storms. And to all this, it is also to be said that all stormy weather will increasingly become stronger and more violent in its entire scope. As my father and you announced in the 1940s and 1950s, and you wrote warnings to this effect and sent them to governments and various organizations worldwide. But also in old prophecies and predictions of Jeremiah and Emmanuel, the events that are taking place now and also in the future time were announced. As for example with the statement, "The time of great trouble is coming, and earthquakes and great storms, and waters tossing to and fro without end." But the fact is that none of the responsible people who received your warnings took the necessary precautions that could have prevented a great deal of the catastrophes and disaster that are now taking place and will continue to come. Precisely in the way of a worldwide birth stop and a decisive birth control in order to prevent the overpopulation that is becoming ever more rapid. And in this respect, the fact is that it was only the tremendous overpopulation growth that brought about all the human machinations that caused violent and irresponsible changes in nature and its fauna and flora, as well as in the atmosphere. The whole of these degenerate machinations, which arose through the mass of overpopulation, had an absolutely destructive effect on everything of nature. Fauna, flora, and the atmosphere, and degenerated into climate change, whereby, however, so much was also permanently destroyed in and on nature that it cannot be regenerated again. Also in the fauna and flora, as a result of the careless, unscrupulous, inexcusable, criminal, rash, and irresponsible machinations of Earth humans due to overpopulation and their ever greedier needs, countless species of life have become extinct, irrevocably for all time. But it is useless to talk about it, because all these facts have often been the subject of our conversations, after which you have also published various things on the internet, where they are accessible to all Earth humans, including the rulers of all countries. But on the whole, hardly any notice is taken of them, and not the slightest action is taken to heed the advice and warnings. The old traditional way of doing things continues, resulting in overpopulation, more destruction of nature, and the destruction and extinction of life forms of flora and fauna. The atmosphere, too, continues to be harassed more and more, especially by industrial emissions and the exhaust fumes of exploding motor vehicles, for which an ever more rapid discrepancy is inexorably developing in relation to the ever more rapidly growing overpopulation. And the fact that everything is becoming more and more precarious with regard to the roads, as a result of the ever more rapidly growing volume of traffic, which is due to the age-related succession of offspring who are becoming capable of driving, is not recognized in any way. So because the roads and streets are becoming ever more inadequate, overcrowded and dangerous to traffic, new ones have to be built, which after only a few years are already inadequate again, so they have to be built again and again and again. This also applies to railways, air traffic, and shipping, whereby all these means of transport produce countless tons of toxic fine dust particles and exhaust fumes every day, which harm the health of many more than the majority of Earth humans, especially in towns and villages, as well as the entire fauna and flora. Many of the Earth humans, animals and plants which are harmed by these toxins, fall so badly ill through toxic fine dust particles, exhaust fumes, and all kinds of chemical emission contamination, etc., that they die of them. But what happens with roads, railways, and streets also happens with residential buildings, because new living space is needed again and again due to the growing offspring, which means that new living space has to be built all the time, which means that more and more land has to be built up, and the freedom of movement of Earth humans is restricted. As a result, more and more fertile land is being destroyed, as is also the case with regard to roads and footpaths, railways and roads and airplane runways, etc., but all this is ignored, because on the one hand, the majority of Earth humans are without understanding and reason and moreover incapable of thinking logically and recognizing the effective facts of a matter, and on the other hand, they are only concerned with financial profit, that they do not care about the destructive and devastating consequences. This is also the case with many more than the majority of those in power, who, in addition to thinking in terms of personal profit, are also addicted to the pursuit of power and do not care about the fact that nature and its fauna and flora are being increasingly destroyed and in some cases completely annihilated, and that the atmosphere is also being ever more catastrophically affected by toxic substances, thus also causing the climate to collapse. And so it goes on inexorably, as a result of which there is no end to all the irresponsibly caused evils. Because the excessive majority of Earth humans, first and foremost that part which should be concerned in a state-leading way with the well-being of the populations and peoples, is so self-important and power-obsessed that it only cares about personal advantages and its own well-being. The truth is that with their few decades of age, they are inexperienced youths who still live according to their false ideas and airs, which are very often threatening. Violent and querulous, as well as megalomaniacally oriented towards revenge and coercion, far removed from reason and rationality, as is the case with inexperienced youths. Connected with this is the addiction to power, which in the final consequence of madness leads to wars being unleashed and peoples being forced into misery. Misery, death, and ruin, as has been the case with Earth humans since time immemorial, and from which their bulk is unwilling to free themselves. There are only big promises and words full of lies, which do not contain any seriousness, but on the contrary only deceitfulness, power, and mendacity.
What can I say other than that you are right? And when I look at today's political military world situation, then I have to agree with you in particular, because in my opinion it is much more dangerous than it was during the Cold War, only that this is trivialized to the outside world. And when I think about it, I also think that an unprecedented economic catastrophe is looming. So I think that there is a tense world situation, and I might say that the small and larger wars going on around the globe, the terror and all the political and military instability makes the world a powder keg that can blow up at any time. A situation is prevailing that is coming to a head more and more, whereby the whole thing worldwide clearly and generally corresponds to a chaos that is incomprehensible to the ordinary citizen, which is without a doubt being promoted in an underhanded and world domination greedy manner by the powerful in the USA, both by those in power and the secret services, whereby I would like to mention the CIA in particular, and also by the military. I would like to exclude Brazil, China, India, Russia, and South Africa, and the so-called SCO nations or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization from this gigantic chaos that the USA is increasingly working up. As far as I know, these countries are still independent of the USA and therefore still truly sovereign or self-determining. However, it cannot be that these countries are left alone and unmolested by the USA, because the USA, in its delusion of world domination and world police behavior, is effectively trying to bring great chaos into these countries as well. And they do this as usual and since time immemorial, for example by instigating insidious coup attempts in these countries, as was the case in Macedonia and Venezuela, among others. But the USA also does not shy away from speculative attacks, as was and is the case with China, where the USA is flirting with a later war. Russia, too, is a constant target of US attacks, for the USA has repeatedly used the media to demonize this country, as it has done to other states. But even the financial reprisals by the IMF, also known as the International Monetary Fund, a specialized agency of the United Nations, whose headquarters is in Washington, D.C., USA are not stopped, as was the case, for example, with the central banks with regard to Greece and Brazil, or with regard to the sanctions against Persia, Iran, and Russia, as well as against North Korea, where the crazy dictator Kim Jong-un leads his bloody scepter. If we continue to look at the chaos that the USA is spreading worldwide, then this fact must also be related to Europe, specifically with regard to the fact that the EU dictatorship, as an ally, is being flooded with waves of refugees, whereby Germany in particular, or its population, is suffering from this, as are other EU dictatorship states. And it is an open secret that these refugee flows have been caused by the USA, but they have also been brought to Germany in particular by the refugee welcome culture of the incompetent and confused Chancellor Angela Merkel, because they come from countries in which so-called anti-terror wars are being waged, in which the USA is working in the front line and also in the background. And that large areas, villages, and cities have been destroyed in the process is well known, as is the fact that the ruins, etc., serve as training grounds for the terrorist militias. The fact that these U.S. terrorist machinations correspond to alleged mistakes by the U.S. administration, as well as the fact that the U.S. is obviously losing control after its interventions, such as in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and in the near future also in Ukraine, is certainly no coincidence, because when everything is looked at closely, I cannot get away from the thought that everything is deliberately and purposefully being done this way. And behind all this, I only see that the USA is perfidiously creating insecurity in the world and deceitfully deceiving the peoples and states and striving for and wanting to realize its world domination-addicted goals.
Whereby you, with your reasoning, are not.
Fishing in the mud, are you?
Yeah, you can put it that way.
Then I have the following question. What is the reason when forgetfulness announces itself?
The memory can only function correctly if it is not constantly burdened with memories. This means that the brain, which has around 100 million nerve cells, has to relieve its memory area to a certain extent at times, which means that memories have to be pushed into the background and forgotten, but which may become active again sooner or later. The intact brain is burdened every moment with innumerable banal impressions, which must necessarily be pushed away or even deleted together with various memories, so that the thoughts can work unmolested. If, therefore, all the banal impressions and unimportant superficial memories were not pushed away or not dissolved in the memory, then, on the one hand, no important memories could be stored and retained for a long time, while, on the other hand, no thinking could take place either, which is dependent on the stage of development as well as on the activity of the sense of thought, but especially on the efficiency of the brain, which can be recognized, for example, by an involuntary wide mouth opening and noisy drawing in and expelling of air.
What do you mean by that? Yawning, perhaps?
That's what it's popularly called?
But how is yawning supposed to provide information about the brain's performance? Yawning is, according to conventional explanations, a phenomenon caused by boredom or tiredness.
This corresponds to an erroneous assertion, because the process of yawning, as you call it, arises from the activity of the brain and thus from brain power. Yawning thus revealing brain power as well as brain activity taking place in both conscious and unconscious settings.
So then yawning effectively has nothing to do with boredom and tiredness, but everything to do with conscious and unconscious thoughts.
That is what I have explained. But it should be noted that usually extensive unconscious thought processes, which are therefore not consciously perceived, trigger the process of yawning in order to compensate for the unconsciously performed activity and performance.
Interesting, thanks. Then I have brought forward all the questions for today, and thank you for all the answers and explanations.
Then I would like to discuss the following things with you, but should be private. Then I will go now, but I want to tell you that Florena and Jana and I will be absent for the next few weeks. It may take until the end of September or a little longer before we return, because the time of our absence is not yet determined. Then farewell, my friend Edouard. Goodbye.
Goodbye to them, Ta, dear friend. Have a good time and see you again.